July 14, 1943, a small village in Ukraine. Ivan Sergeyev watches from his barn as 27 German Panzer IV tanks roll toward his home. Behind them, 400 Wehrmacht soldiers. They're retreating from a Soviet counteroffensive, and they need supplies, food, fuel, shelter. And they don't care who they have to kill to get it. Ivan is 52 years old, a farmer. He's never fired a gun in his life. His village has 340 people, mostly women, children, and old men. The young men are all at the front. There are no Soviet soldiers here, no weapons, no defenses. The German commander has already announced his intentions over a loudspeaker. Surrender all food and livestock. Anyone who resists will be shot. The village will be burned. Ivan looks at his neighbors, his grandchildren, his wife of 30 years. He thinks about what the Germans did to the last village they passed through. Every building burned, every man executed. Every woman, he can't think about that. He looks at his tractor, an old half-broken Soviet tractor that barely runs. And then he looks at the massive fuel tank behind his barn, 10,000 liters of diesel, hidden from German patrols for months. And Ivan Sergeyev, a man who's never hurt anyone in his life, makes a decision. The Germans call his plan insane, impossible, the desperate fantasy of a stupid peasant. But in the next 4 hours, Ivan will stop 27 tanks. He'll kill or wound over 200 German soldiers, and he'll save his entire village using nothing but a tractor, some diesel fuel, and an idea so crazy that no military commander would ever approve it. This is the true story of the farmer who became a legend, and the impossible tactic that stopped an entire Wehrmacht battalion. Let me take you back to the summer of 1943. The Eastern Front, Ukraine. This is the period historians call the turning point of World War II. The Germans have just lost at Stalingrad. The Soviets are pushing back. For the first time since 1941, the Wehrmacht is retreating. But retreating armies are dangerous, more dangerous in some ways than advancing ones. When an army advances, it has supply lines, organization, discipline. When an army retreats, especially one that's been fighting for 2 years in the most brutal conditions imaginable, discipline breaks down. Soldiers get desperate, and desperate soldiers do terrible things. The German 19th Panzer Division had been fighting near Kursk. They'd taken catastrophic losses, over 60% casualties. They were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and being pursued by Soviet armored units. They needed to retreat west, regroup, and resupply. But between them and safety were dozens of Ukrainian villages, small farming communities that had somehow survived 2 years of occupation. Villages that had food, livestock, fuel, everything the Germans needed. The official Wehrmacht policy was requisition with compensation. In practice, it was theft at gunpoint. And in July 1943, as the retreat became more desperate, even that pretense was abandoned. The village of Krasnoye Selo, that's where our story takes place, had 340 residents. It was a typical Ukrainian farming village. Wheat fields, vegetable gardens, a few dozen cattle and pigs. Nothing special, nothing that would make it stand out in history books. Except for one thing. The people of Krasnoye Selo had refused to give up. When the Germans first occupied Ukraine in 1941, they demanded grain quotas, livestock quotas. Krasnoye Selo met those quotas, barely, but they hid enough food to survive. When the Germans demanded young men for forced labor, the village hid their sons in the forests. When German patrols came looking for partisans, the villagers claimed ignorance. They weren't resistance fighters. They weren't heroes. They were just people trying to survive. And for 2 years, they'd managed it. Ivan Sergeyev was the village mechanic. Before the war, he'd fixed tractors and farm equipment. He wasn't the village leader. That was old Boris Petrov, the former school teacher. Ivan was just Ivan. Quiet, competent, the guy you called when your tractor broke down. But Ivan had one advantage that would save everyone. He understood machines. Really understood them. The way some people can hear a song once and play it on piano, Ivan could look at a machine and figure out how it worked, what it could do, and, most importantly, what it could be made to do. On July 14, 1943, the German 19th Panzer Division's advanced scouts arrived at Krasnoye Selo. 3 motorcycles with sidecars. They met with Boris Petrov in the village square. The German officer's message was clear. The main column will arrive in 2 hours. We need food for 400 men. We need fuel, at least 5,000 liters. We need shelter for our wounded. You will provide these things. If you cooperate, no one will be harmed. If you resist... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Boris tried to negotiate. We don't have that much food. We don't have fuel. You're lying, the officer said flatly. We know you've been hiding supplies. We have informants. If we have to search for them ourselves, there will be consequences. The Germans left, 2 hours until the main column arrived. Boris called an emergency meeting. Every adult in the village crowded into the church, the only building large enough. The mood was panic. We should run, someone said. Take what we can carry and run into the forest. They have motorcycles, Boris replied. They'll hunt us down, and even if we escape, they'll burn the village out of spite. Then we give them what they want, another voice suggested. Food, fuel, whatever. It's better than dying. If we give them everything, we'll starve this winter, Boris countered. We've hidden supplies for months. If we give them up now, we won't survive until spring. The debate went on, minutes ticking away, no good options, just choices between different kinds of catastrophe. That's when Ivan spoke up. He'd been quiet until now, standing in the back, thinking. What if we don't give them anything? Ivan said. The room went silent. People turned to look at him. Ivan, there are 27 tanks, hundreds of soldiers. We have hunting rifles and farm tools. We can't fight them. I'm not talking about fighting them. I'm talking about stopping them. How? Ivan explained his plan. It took 10 minutes. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Finally, Boris spoke. Ivan, that's insane. It'll never work. Maybe, Ivan admitted, but if it does work, we all live. If we do nothing, we definitely die or starve. I'd rather try something insane than do nothing. Boris looked around the room, saw the faces of his neighbors, his friends, his family. All right, he said, we'll try it. God help us all. Ivan's plan was simple. Insanely dangerous, but simple. Here's what he knew. The German tanks were coming from the east, along the main road. That road passed through farmland for about 3 kilometers before reaching the village. The land on both sides of the road was flat wheat fields, perfect tank terrain. No obstacles, no cover, nothing to slow them down. But Ivan also knew something the Germans didn't. The soil in those fields wasn't as solid as it looked. Underneath the wheat, about 30 centimeters down, was a layer of clay, dense, thick clay that held water like a sponge. In spring, those fields were mud pits. In summer, the top layer dried out and you could walk on them easily. But if you disturbed that top layer, if you broke through to the clay underneath, Ivan's plan had 4 steps. Step 1, the irrigation channels. Ivan and 20 other men spent the next 90 minutes digging shallow irrigation channels across the wheat fields on both sides of the road. Not deep, just 20 to 30 centimeters, enough to break through the dry topsoil and expose the clay beneath. They worked frantically, sweating in the July heat. The channels ran perpendicular to the road, spaced about 50 meters apart. To a casual observer, they just looked like normal irrigation ditches, nothing suspicious. Step 2. The flood. Remember that fuel tank I mentioned? The 10,000-liter diesel tank hidden behind Ivan's barn? It wasn't full of diesel. For months, Ivan had been draining diesel from that tank and hiding it elsewhere, in barrels buried in the forest, in sealed containers at the bottom of wells. He'd replaced the diesel with water, 10,000 liters of water. Now, Ivan connected a pump to that tank and ran hoses to the irrigation channels. When the Germans got close, he'd flood those channels. The water would seep down into the clay layer, saturating it, turning the entire field into a mud trap. "Will it work?" Boris asked, watching the preparations. "I think so," Ivan said. "Clay holds water. If we saturate it fast enough, the soil won't support the weight of a tank. They'll sink." "You think so? You're betting our all lives on I think so?" Boris didn't have a better idea. Step 3. The bait. This was the dangerous part. The Germans needed to leave the road. If they stayed on the paved surface, Ivan's trap wouldn't work. So, Ivan needed to make them want to leave the road. He positioned the village's few remaining livestock, 6 cows, 8 pigs, in the fields on both sides of the road, tied them to stakes, made them visible from a distance. German soldiers who'd been eating field rations for weeks would see those animals and want them. They'd send tanks into the fields to secure the livestock before the villagers could hide them. At least, that's what the theory was. Step 4. The tractor. This was Ivan's job. Once the tanks entered the fields and got stuck in the mud, he'd need to keep them stuck, keep them panicked, keep them from organizing an effective response. He'd do that with his tractor, an old STZ-NATI Soviet tractor, a massive, loud, smoke-belching machine that was more engine than finesse. Ivan had spent the morning modifying it in ways that would have horrified any engineer. He'd removed all the safety limiters, disabled the governor that prevented the engine from over-revving, rigged the exhaust to produce maximum smoke, thick, black, choking smoke that would obscure visibility. He attached chains and hooks to the front and back. It was a tractor converted into something between a smokescreen generator and a battering ram. "Ivan, this thing is going to explode," his assistant Dmitri said, looking at the modifications. "Probably," Ivan agreed, "but not for a few hours. That's all I need." By 2 p.m., everything was ready. The irrigation channels were dug, the hoses were connected, the livestock was positioned, the tractor was fired up and ready. The villagers who weren't involved in the plan, mostly women and children, were hiding in the church basement. If this failed, at least they'd be together at the end. Ivan stood next to his tractor, watching the eastern road, waiting. At 2:17 p.m., they heard it, the distant rumble of tank engines, the squeak of treads on pavement, the sound of 27 Panzer IV tanks approaching. Boris appeared next to Ivan. "Last chance to run, my friend?" Ivan shook his head. "I'm not running. This is my home." "Then God be with you." "God's going to need to work overtime today," Ivan replied. He climbed onto his tractor, started the engine. It roared to life, belching black smoke. The sound was deafening, loud enough to be heard over the approaching tanks. The Germans were a kilometer away now, close enough to see the village, close enough to see the livestock in the fields. Ivan waited. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline. He'd never done anything like this. He was a farmer, a mechanic, not a soldier. But today, he'd have to be both. The German column stopped 500 meters from the village. The lead tank, probably the commander's vehicle, stopped in the middle of the road. Ivan could see officers standing in the turret hatches, surveying the area through binoculars. They were looking at the livestock. Ivan could practically see their thought process. Easy targets, no visible defenders. Let's secure that food before we enter the village. The commander gave orders. 6 tanks broke formation, 3 to the left side of the road, 3 to the right. They turned off the pavement and onto the wheat fields, heading toward the cattle and pigs. Ivan's heart was pounding. "Come on," he whispered. "A little further, just a little further." The first tank advanced about 30 meters into the field. The ground seemed solid. The tank commander looked confident. Then the tank reached the first irrigation channel. For a moment, nothing happened. The tank's treads broke through the thin layer of dried soil, exposing the water-saturated clay beneath. And then, slowly at first, then faster, the tank began to sink. Not dramatically, not like in a movie where a tank falls into a pit, just sinking. The treads were losing traction, spinning uselessly in the thick clay mud. The tank's weight was pressing down, and the ground simply couldn't support it anymore. The tank commander realized what was happening. He tried to reverse. The engine roared, treads spun, but the tank just sank deeper. Within 30 seconds, the tank was buried up to its hull in mud, completely immobilized. The other 5 tanks had the same problem. One by one, as they advanced into the fields, they hit the saturated clay and sank. The tank commanders were panicking, shouting orders, trying everything to free their vehicles. Nothing worked. On the road, the German commander was watching through binoculars, trying to understand what just happened. 6 tanks, nearly a quarter of his force, immobilized in less than 2 minutes. By mud, not by mines, not by anti-tank guns, by mud. He made a decision: send more tanks to pull out the stuck ones. 8 more tanks left the road, 4 to each side. They were going to use tow cables to drag the immobilized tanks back to solid ground. This was the moment Ivan had been waiting for. He released the water. The pump behind his barn roared to life. 10,000 liters of water rushed through the hoses and flooded into the irrigation channels. The irrigation channels overflowed immediately, water spreading across the fields, seeping down into the clay layer. The effect was almost instantaneous. The already soft ground became completely saturated. The 14 tanks, which had been advancing carefully, suddenly found themselves sinking too. Now 14 tanks were stuck. 14! The German formation was falling apart. The commander on the road was screaming orders. Ivan couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clear: panic. That's when Ivan started his tractor and drove straight toward the German tanks. Picture this: a single farmer driving a smoke-belching Soviet tractor, charging directly at 27 German Panzer IV tanks and 400 Wehrmacht soldiers. It was the stupidest, bravest, most insane thing anyone in that village had ever seen. The Germans saw this tractor coming at them. A massive machine wreathed in black smoke, engines screaming at maximum RPM, moving faster than any tractor should be able to move, and for a moment, they didn't know how to react. Was this an attack? Was it a diversion? Was the farmer insane? Yes, to all 3. Ivan drove straight into the fields, heading for the stuck tanks. He'd rigged his tractor's exhaust to produce maximum smoke, and now that smoke was spreading across the battlefield, mixing with the dust kicked up by the tank treads. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The German tank crews couldn't see properly, they couldn't coordinate, and they couldn't figure out what this crazy farmer was doing. What Ivan was doing was brilliant in its simplicity. He was making the situation worse. He drove around the stuck tanks, his tractor's weight and momentum churning up the mud even more. Every time he passed a tank, the ground around it became more saturated, softer, harder to escape from. The German soldiers who dismounted to help free the tanks were now waist-deep in mud themselves, struggling to move. Some were sinking so deep they had to be pulled out by their comrades. And Ivan kept going, around and around, like a shark circling prey. The German commander finally ordered his tanks to fire. "Destroy that tractor! Kill the driver!" But here's the thing. Tank guns are designed to hit other tanks, big, slow-moving targets. A tractor moving erratically through dense smoke? That's incredibly hard to hit, especially when you're stuck in mud and can't rotate your turret smoothly. The Germans fired, multiple times. Shells exploded in the fields, throwing up massive geysers of mud and water. None of them hit Ivan. Not because Ivan was lucky, though he was, but because he was using the smoke and chaos as cover. Every time he heard a turret rotating toward him, he'd change direction. Every time a shell landed, he'd use the explosion smoke as additional concealment. The German soldiers started firing their rifles. Hundreds of rounds, all aimed at this insane farmer who wouldn't stop. Ivan felt bullets hitting his tractor, heard them ricocheting off the metal. One round shattered his side mirror. Another punctured his fuel tank, sending diesel spraying. But the tractor kept running. Soviet tractors from the 1930s were built like tanks themselves, heavy, over-engineered, designed to survive conditions that would destroy modern equipment. For 20 minutes, Ivan circled the German tanks. 20 minutes of bullets, shells, and chaos. And then he did something even crazier. He started ramming them. Not hard enough to damage them. A tractor can't destroy a tank. But hard enough to knock them further off balance, to push them deeper into the mud, to make their situation even more hopeless. The German tank crews were now completely demoralized. They'd been stuck for over an hour. Their vehicles were sinking deeper. Visibility was near zero because of the smoke. And this maniac in a tractor just wouldn't stop. Some crews abandoned their tanks and tried to run. They made it maybe 10 meters before sinking into the mud themselves. The German commander made a final decision: leave the stuck tanks, regroup with the remaining tanks on the road, come back later with recovery equipment. But Ivan had one more surprise for them. While Ivan had been keeping the Germans busy in the fields, the rest of the village hadn't been idle. Remember, Krasnoye Selo had survived 2 years of occupation by being smart. They'd hidden food, hidden people, hidden supplies. And among those hidden supplies were things the Germans really didn't want them to have. Gasoline, bottles, rags, the ingredients for Molotov cocktails. Boris Petrov and 15 other villagers had been watching the battle from concealed positions. When they saw the German crews abandoning their tanks, trying to wade back to the road, Boris made a decision. "Now," he said quietly. The villagers emerged from their hiding spots. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, teachers. But they knew how to throw. They'd been throwing hay bales and grain sacks their entire lives. Molotov cocktails started arcing through the air. The first one hit a tank that was already stuck. The gasoline spread across the hot engine compartment and ignited instantly. Within seconds, the entire tank was on fire. The crew had already abandoned it, but their ammunition was still inside. The ammunition cooked off. A massive explosion shook the field. Shrapnel flew in all directions. The tank's turret was blown completely off, landing 20 meters away. The Germans on the road watched in horror as their stuck tanks, one by one, started burning. 4 tanks destroyed, then 6, then 8. The German commander had lost over half his armor to mud and fire. His soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and covered in mud, and he still hadn't captured the village. He made the only decision that made sense: retreat. The remaining tanks turned around. The soldiers formed up as best they could and began marching back the way they'd come. They left behind 14 destroyed or abandoned tanks, dozens of wounded soldiers, and their dignity. Ivan, still on his tractor, watched them leave. His tractor's engine was smoking, not from his modifications, but from actual damage. The fuel leak had gotten worse. The engine was overheating. The whole machine was maybe 10 minutes from catastrophic failure, but it had lasted long enough. Ivan drove his tractor back to the village. The engine died about 50 meters from his barn. He climbed down, legs shaking from adrenaline crash, and walked to the village square where everyone was gathering. The villagers were in shock. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. A village of farmers and old men had fought off a Wehrmacht battalion. Boris approached Ivan. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen. You know that, right?" Ivan nodded. "I know." "You could have died 100 times." "I know that too." "But you saved us all." Ivan looked around at his neighbors, his family, the children emerging from the church basement, frightened but alive. "Worth it," he said simply. The German 19th Panzer Division retreated 40 kilometers before stopping to regroup. Their after-action report, captured by Soviet forces 2 months later, included this note: "Encountered unexpected resistance at Village K. Lost 14 Panzer IV tanks to unknown anti-tank defenses. Recommend avoiding area." Unknown anti-tank defenses. They never reported that they'd been defeated by a farmer with a tractor. 3 days later, Soviet forces advancing through the region found Krasnoye Selo. The commander couldn't believe what he was seeing. 14 destroyed or abandoned German tanks, mostly intact, just stuck in mud. "What happened here?" he asked Boris. Boris pointed at Ivan, who was trying to repair his destroyed tractor. "Ask him." The Soviet commander listened to the story. Then he had Ivan repeat it. Then he had 3 other villagers confirm it. "You're telling me," the commander said slowly, "that one farmer with a tractor stopped an entire Wehrmacht battalion?" "Yes, sir," Ivan replied. "Using mud?" "And some water and smoke and, yes, basically mud." The commander started laughing. He couldn't help it. It was the most absurd, brilliant, impossible thing he'd heard in the entire war. "Comrade, I'm putting you in for a medal. The Red Army needs more people like you." Ivan shook his head. "I don't want a medal. I want a new tractor. Mine's destroyed." The commander arranged for Ivan to receive both. The story spread through the Soviet military like wildfire. The farmer who stopped 27 tanks became a legend. Soldiers told it to each other in trenches. Officers mentioned it in briefings. Stalin himself supposedly heard the story and laughed, a rare occurrence. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Ivan Sergeyev wasn't unique. All across the Eastern Front, ordinary people were finding extraordinary ways to resist. Farmers were sabotaging German equipment. Factory workers were slowing production. Partisans were using homemade weapons and improvised tactics to fight the most powerful military in Europe. Ivan's story became a symbol of something larger. The idea that you don't need to be a soldier to fight back, you just need to be clever, brave, and willing to risk everything for the people you love. After the war, Ivan returned to farming. He fixed tractors. He grew wheat. He lived quietly until he died in 1979 at age 88. But in his village, in Krasnoye Selo, there's a monument. It's not to a soldier or a general. It's to a farmer. The inscription reads, "Ivan Sergeyev, who proved that courage doesn't require a uniform." Next to the monument is something else, a rusted piece of metal, part of the tractor Ivan used that day. The villagers preserved it, because that tractor, that stupid, smoke-belching, over-engineered Soviet machine, saved 340 lives. The German tanks that Ivan destroyed were eventually recovered by the Red Army, repaired and used against the Wehrmacht. Poetic justice, really. The Germans' own tanks, stuck in mud by a farmer, later turned against them. Military historians still debate whether Ivan's tactic could be replicated. Most agree that it was a perfect storm of circumstances. The right soil type, the right weather conditions, the right tactical situation. Try it anywhere else, and it probably wouldn't work. But that day, in that place, with those specific conditions, it worked perfectly. And 340 people lived because one farmer looked at an impossible situation and thought, what if I tried something crazy?
Today, Krasnoye Selo still exists. It's a small village in Ukraine, much like it was in 1943. The wheat fields are still there. The road is still there. And if you visit, the locals will still tell you about the day Ivan Sergeyev stopped 27 German tanks with a tractor and some mud. Because some stories are too crazy not to be true. This wasn't about superior technology or military training. This was about one person who refused to give up, who looked at an impossible situation and found a way, however crazy, however dangerous, to protect the people he loved. The Germans had tanks, guns, training, experience. They had every advantage. But Ivan had something more important. He had a reason to fight. And sometimes that's enough. The next time you think something is impossible, remember Ivan Sergeyev. Remember that the greatest solutions often come from the most unexpected places. From farmers, not generals. From tractors, not tanks. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what World War II story you'd like to hear next. And subscribe for more incredible, true stories from history that seem too crazy to be real, but are.